This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Verso Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is The Jail is Everywhere, Fighting the New Geography of Mass Incarceration by Jack Norden, Lydia Palo-Hobbs, and Judah Shept, with a foreword by Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Jails are now the fastest-growing sector of the U.S. carceral state. As they grow, they transform the regions around them, subordinating healthcare provision and employment opportunity to carceral concerns. With jails everywhere, resistance is too. Campaigns against new or expanded jails have emerged all over the U.S. While there's some coordination between these struggles, they tend to be isolated from each other and broader movements. The Jail is Everywhere maps this new terrain, consolidating experiences from jail fights across the country. It foregrounds the hard-forged analyses of anti-jail organizers as they take us through campaigns that are at the new center of the carceral state. The Jail is Everywhere, Fighting the New Geography of Mass Incarceration by Jack Norden, Lydia Palo-Hobbs, and Judah Shept, with a foreword by Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Out now from Verso Books. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. Over the first weekend in April, I joined scholars from all over the place in Houston, Texas, for the inaugural World Academic Forum for Palestine. We gathered as Israel's ongoing campaign has, in only a few short months, killed more than 33,000 Palestinians, wounding more than 75,000. Even as those numbers are so hard to fathom, they're likely an undercount considering the untold bodies, men, women, and children lying under the rubble. More than 62% of homes in Gaza have been razed, the vast majority of the population displaced. This is a clear effort to ethnically cleanse Gaza of Palestinians, itself part of a century-old campaign to liquidate Palestinians as a people. Scholars were gathered together amid a genocide that is also a determined campaign of scholasticide. As the conference organizers note, quote, "Scholasticide has intensified on an unprecedented scale. Israeli colonial policy in Gaza has now shifted from a focus on systematic destruction to total annihilation of education. There is indeed an intimate relationship between genocide and scholasticide. Raphael Lamkin, the pioneering Polish Jewish legal scholar who first defined genocide and played a key role in inserting the concept into international law, saw genocide as an effort to undermine the fundamental basis of the social order. Key to this effort, in Lamkin's conception, was the assault on the cultures of national, ethnic, racial, or religious collectivities." That was me quoting the conference organizers. Every single university in Gaza has now been destroyed. Thousands of professors and students have been killed and severely injured. This is the opposite of an accident. This is not unfortunate collateral damage. Israeli academia is complicit. We must urgently end U.S. military aid to Israel and pursue boycott, divestment, and sanctions until this genocide is over and Palestine is free from the river to the sea. Today, we hear from the Palestinian historian Abdel Razzaq Takriti on the deep colonial context required to understand Zionism and the national liberation struggle against it. Arab Jewish historian Avi Shlaim on the history of Israeli politics leading up to this genocide. Palestinian legal scholar Noura Erakat on the frameworks constructed to legitimate the increasing widespread killability of Palestinians. Lebanese Palestinian historian Ussama Makdisi on how the Western elite commitment to Zionism is a product of denying the capitalist colonialist origins of the Holocaust. Anti-Zionist Israeli historian Ilan Pappé on scholasticide. And then, lastly, we will hear from Ghada Ageel Hamdan, a third-generation Palestinian refugee and political scientist who will recount the experience of the mass murder and displacement of her extended family in Gaza. Next week, we'll be back with episode 8 of Thawra, our rolling series on 20th century Arab radicalisms, which I'm doing with none other than Abdel Razzaq Takriti, who's featured in this episode and played a lead role in organizing this important conference. This next episode of Thawra will focus on the development of Palestinian national politics after the Nakba throughout the 1950s leading up to the foundation of Fatah. In the meantime, please catch up on Thawra and visit Haymarket's YouTube page to catch the rest of this historic conference. These excerpts are just a handful of a much larger number of really, really important remarks. As always, if you appreciate what we do here at The Dig, and I know many of you do, after all, you are here listening to The Dig, please support the podcast at patreon.com/The Dig. That's patreon.com/The Dig. We really couldn't put this podcast out there with no paywall so that everyone can listen without you contributing. Today, I also want to encourage you to donate to Palestine Legal. Palestine Legal protects the civil and constitutional rights of people in the United States who speak out for Palestinian freedom. We have a powerful solidarity movement in this country, but we are under constant attack, and we need lawyers at Palestine Legal to defend us. Donate to Palestine Legal at palestinelegal.org. There's a link in the show notes. Okay, first up is Abdel Razzaq Takriti, who teaches history at Rice University. A scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements, he's the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman. He is also my guest and co-creator of Thawra, our rolling series on 20th century Arab radicalisms.
So this has been a very difficult conference to attend for all of us, I believe. After hearing what's going on in Palestine, and what's going on in Gaza specifically, it is difficult to come in and give a talk about history. But we must go back to history, because what we are seeing now is an internationally authorized and organized genocide. And the idea that I want to communicate to you today is that international authorization for the colonization and destruction of Palestine is a very, very, very old phenomenon. It goes back actually to the very beginning of the story of the colonization of Palestine. Perhaps what is unique about the colonization of Palestine, if we look at it in comparative settler colonial context, is that this was a settler colonialism that was enacted by an international order. Okay, most settler colonial cases are carried out by one country. It occupies a space, it authorizes the colonization of that space by a settler group, and it oversees that process. In the case of Palestine, it was a very late example of settler colonialism, and it happened in the context of the post-World War I settlement, where the League of Nations officially authorized the settler colonization of that space under the terms of the so-called mandate system. Let's consider the mandate system. In the Palestine Mandate, Article 1 of the mandate was that the mandatory shall have full powers of legislation. This was fairly typical and administration. But Article 2, and that's the one that matters, says, quote, the mandatory shall be responsible for placing the country under such political, administrative, and economic conditions as will secure the establishment of the Jewish national home as laid out in the preamble. They laid out in the preamble the idea of creating a Jewish national home in Palestine, okay? Which means basically transforming a territory that was predominantly Arab into a territory that is predominantly European. Because what a Jewish national home meant at the time was the transference of Europe's Jewish population into Palestine. Quite simply. Forget about all the legal formulations. Forget about all the historic justifications. They had one justification for this historic connection. There's many people who have many historic connections to many different parts of the world. That doesn't mean they could come and take the place of other peoples. And that was the argument that Palestinians said over and over again. And you know what? They're still not heard about when it comes to that argument. Now, this was authorized by the victors of the First World War. It was an international decision. When we use the word international, by the way, we mean the states that are in power. It doesn't mean that it's the peoples of the world. Peoples of the world were all under the boot of these people in power. There were four great powers running the world. And we still have this phenomenon now. The inequities in the global system were responsible for the colonization of Palestine back then, and are responsible for the Gaza genocide right now. And we see this in the United Nations, the successor of the League of Nations. We see this in the International Court of Justice. It is not coincidental that it is a great African country that had witnessed a revolution, a sister revolution of the Palestinian revolution, that has come in to the aid of the Palestinian people at the ICJ. And it is not coincidental that all the sabotage that is done at the UN and in the different legal spheres and humanitarian spheres and diplomatic spheres to try to stop the genocide from happening, all of this sabotage is done by the Western powers. What is their justification? We've heard it over and over again in this conference. It is racism. And I will illustrate this with reference to the man who set the terms of the mandate. I keep on repeating his quotes. I hate quoting him. He's a very terrible, evil man named Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, when asked why did he incorporate the terms of the mandate in 1922, why did he do them despite the fact that there had been two rebellions, Palestinian rebellions, that had been investigated by British commissions, and these rebellions proved that the Palestinians do not want their land to be colonized? His answer to the Peel Commission, which was asking him this question in 1937 about 1922, when the terms were passed, was very clear. He said, "I do not admit that the dog in the manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, or at any rate a more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place. I do not admit it. I do not think that the Red Indians had any right to say the American continent belongs to us and we are not going to have any of these European settlers coming in here. They had not the right, nor had they the power." I repeat this quote in almost every talk I give, because this is at the heart of what we're dealing with. This is at the heart of what we're dealing with today. Biden, Brett McCurk was behind Biden. the entire administration. Their views of Palestinians are no different. Their views of our people in Gaza are no different. That is proven by the practices that they are authorizing, by the practices that they are arming. They come in one day, say, we want humanitarian supplies to enter, and at the same day, they send in weapons with which to destroy our people, kill them, with which to murder our children, with which to turn our hospitals, schools, universities into rubble. They engage in another phenomenon, and this phenomenon matters, which is the attempt to destroy our political institutions and to destroy our military capacities, which are the capacity for self-defense. In the colonial logic, you see, from the very beginning of the story, from the time of the British, only the settler colonist is allowed to be armed. There are two categories of humanity in this world. Group of people who have the so-called right of self-defense, who have the right to bear arms, and others who must be at the receiving ends of these arms and sit there and accept being murdered with them without any resistance. Now, you might be slightly familiar with this logic living in this country. We see it at a different scale in a different set of communities. Remember what the Black Panthers were talking about? Yesterday we heard a very inspiring speech by a great scholar of that movement. That was a part of the logic that we have here. There we have it on a national level. Here it's expressed in racialized segregation terms. There it's done on the level of colonizing one people through another. The logic is the same. Some people get to defend themselves. Some people do not get to defend themselves. They get to be assaulted. And should they ever defend themselves, they'll be presented as aggressors, as evil, as committers of evils that are greater than those committed by any human population in history. Now, let me tell you why Gaza proves to be a problem for these people. Those that were trying to destroy the ability of Palestinians to express themselves politically and to defend themselves militarily. By the way, it's a difficult conversation to have. Some people will say, what is Professor Takriti talking about? How dare you talk about self-defense or anything else? That is terrorism in this country. Well, I'm a historian of revolutions and counter-revolutions. I'm a historian of the traditions of war as they're exemplified in colonial situations. And whether it's in Algeria or South Africa or Palestine, we always have this dynamic going on. Every colonized group was presented in this country as not having the right to defend itself. Okay? And should you talk about it in absolute terms, you're presented as promoting a certain strategy or tactic. I'm not doing that here in this podium. I'm just reflecting on the history of this space, where one group of people is armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, with the top fighter jets, with rockets, and another group of people is totally expected to be bombed and sit there silent. Gaza proved to be a problem for this logic because Gaza was the space, as Adil has mentioned, into which the entirety of the southern part of Palestine was distilled in 1948. That happened over the course of an operation that took place in October 1948 that's known as Operation Yoav. During this operation, most of the major cities of southern Palestine and big towns, ones that were mentioned by Dr. Ahmed Joudah, our beloved Nakba survivor who shared with us his testimony, his very powerful testimony earlier. Most of those spaces were ethnically cleansed during that operation, including his beloved hometown Isdud, but also Bir al-Saba, also Majdal, also Hamama, all of these areas and many others. Dawaime. This was Operation Yoav. Guess who was named after Operation Yoav? The current butcher of Gaza, the current Israeli defense minister that they're presenting here as a moderate, Yoav Gallant. His father was a war criminal who participated in the ethnic cleansing of all of these cities and villages in 1948. He expelled their inhabitants and placed them in Gaza. The Egyptian forces were unable to defend those areas. And moreover, they had diminished the capacity of Palestinians from being able to defend those areas, because the minute they entered, those forces had entered Palestine, their first thing they did was disarm the local Palestinian units that were defending these villages. The populations of those areas ended up in Gaza. They ended up in the small territory that the Egyptian forces were able to defend, which was a very thin strip, 40 kilometers long, and at most 8 kilometers wide. This is what we're talking about. It's tiny. The entirety of the southern part of Palestine was concentrated there. Unlike other parts of Palestine, that's the only part that people were allowed to call themselves, were still allowed to call themselves Palestinian in after 48. Those that ended up in West Bank, those that came from the central hill country, those that ended up in Jordan, they were absorbed into a different nationality project. A project that sought to annex the West Bank to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Those that ended up in Lebanon were so oppressed that they couldn't form political organizations. And those that ended up in Syria became absorbed into mainly Syrian and pan-Arab political dynamics. Gaza was special because that was a place where you could say, I am Palestinian and I'm going to organize as a Palestinian. I'll give you an example. The Palestine Communist Party, the only place where you had the Palestine Communist Party remaining was in Gaza. In 48, our compatriots there, they had to join the Israeli Communist Party. In Jordan, they had to create the Jordanian Communist Party. Only in Gaza, you had the Palestine Communist Party. Fatah started in Gaza for a reason, or was primarily started by sons of Gaza for a reason, and daughters of Gaza for a reason. Again, because Gaza was a space where you could have the formation of a particularly Palestinian way of thinking. That's why all the historic leaderships of that formation, which is the largest in Palestine at the time, for a long time, were concentrated in Gaza. The Muslim Brotherhood, which is the original party that out of which Hamas emerged, also was disproportionately powerful in Gaza. So when we look at Gaza today, we see that it's a place. I know that Adil has told us about its marginality in scholarship, but I'll tell you something. In Palestinian political life, and I'm a scholar of Palestinian political life, it is actually enormously central. and has played central roles historically and persistently to this very day. All the major Palestinian factions have something to do with Gaza. Even the PFLP, which did not start in Gaza, some of its strongest moments of resistance in the occupied territories happened in the early 1970s in Gaza during what was known as the Guevara Gaza period. So Gaza was always a problem because it had an active political life and it was a site of resistance. It's a place where people said no. You know why they said no? Because also resistance in Palestine is organized around class lines, and it primarily emanates from refugee communities. It's the strongest in refugee communities. And Gaza is one of our largest places in which the refugees are concentrated. So, what's their answer to this? Is destruction. Is complete annihilation. They don't want any form of Palestinian independence from Western control. In the West Bank, the Palestinian people are shackled by an authority that is under US and Israeli domination. Our people there are very brave. They've been trying to remove these shackles for a long time. But they're tied. They're under the boot. They're in a lot of pain. Now they're watching their sisters and brothers being slaughtered. You hear them all feeling powerless. They're trying to rise up. They can't. In the refugee camps in the surrounding region, our people tried to rebel for years, for decades, but they were defeated. In Jordan, they were defeated in 1970. In Lebanon, they were expelled in 1982. The only place where the Palestinians have had any independent political or military capacity in this world was in Gaza. So that is the heart and the crux of the matter. Today in Palestine, Gaza represents a concept we call as al-'izza, dignity, karama. That's why you hear so many genocide victims today. If you follow the Arabic news, you'll never see them getting interviewed on the US news because they don't interview people. Maybe they'll interview humanitarian cases. But you know what? If you watch the Arabic channels, you'll see them. And they'll come and tell you, you know what? I have karama, I have dignity, I am hungry, but I am staying here. The only way to defeat this colonialism is to defeat this concept, this racist concept. The only way to defeat colonialism is to accept that the Palestinians, like other peoples in this world, have a right to self-determination, have a right to independence, have a right to control their fate, have a right to return to their land, all of their land. If we apply universal rights to Palestine, if we stop obsessing about the welfare of the settler at the expense of the life of the native, then we shall see a world in which the genocide that we've been discussing today is absent. So that is what we're here for today, is to protect our minds from the distortion, but also is to play our role as scholars and thinkers, to speak the truth to power. Thank you very much.
That was Abdel Razzaq Takriti. Next up is Avi Shlaim, an Arab Jew born in Baghdad before the Zionist State's foundation and one of the world's leading historians of the region. In the late 1980s, Shlaim became one of Israel's so-called new historians, alongside Ilan Pappé, who we'll hear from shortly, and Benny Morris, who, unlike the other two, today takes a staunchly reactionary and Zionist line. The new historians used Israeli archives to demolish the prevailing national myths of the Jewish state's founding and to prove that Israel, a settler colonial power backed by Western imperialism, had forcibly ethnically cleansed much of historic Palestine with overwhelming military force. The research was important, but a significant part of that importance was that the research exposed to Israelis what Arabs already knew. Here's Avi Shlaim, an emeritus fellow of St. Antony's College, Oxford, an emeritus professor of international relations at the University of Oxford, and a fellow of the British Academy. He's the author of multiple books, including the recently published autobiography, 3 Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew.
Good evening. I'd like to begin by paying tribute to Abdel Takriti and his colleagues for organizing this remarkable and truly important gathering of scholars against the war on Palestine. Abed suggested that I use my 15 minutes to put Gaza in a historic context and to focus on the Israeli side. So I've decided to organize my comments around the title of Beyond the Iron Wall, a word of explanation. In 1923, Ze'ev Jabotinsky, the spiritual father of the Israeli right, published an article called The Iron Wall, We and the Arabs. And in it he wrote, the Palestinians are a people. They are not a rabble. They are not a rabble. They are a people. No people in history has ever willingly made room for another people to come and create a state on their land. And therefore Palestinian resistance to the Zionist project is inevitable and inescapable. A voluntary agreement between the two sides is not possible. The only way to realize the Zionist project is unilaterally and by military force. Stage one of this was the basic Zionist strategy in the conflict since the 1920s. Stage one of the strategy is to build Jewish military force. The Arabs would knock their head against the wall. Eventually they would give up any hope of defeating the Zionists on the battleground. And then would come the time for stage two of the strategy, which is negotiations with the Palestinians about their rights and status in Palestine. So the essence of the strategy was negotiations from strength. The problem is that the politicians of the right fell in love with the first part of the strategy of building up Israel's military force, but they forgot about the second part of the strategy, which is using this military force as an instrument to negotiate a settlement with the Palestinians. Yitzhak Rabin was the only Israeli leader who went a very, very modest way towards a political settlement of the conflict with the Palestinians. He did this by signing the Oslo Accord in 1993. But all the concessions came from the PLO. The PLO is probably the most flexible, the most moderate national liberation movement in history in terms of what it expected from the colonizer. It gave up its claim to 78% of historic Palestine in the hope that it would get an independent Palestinian state on Gaza and the West Bank with a capital city in East Jerusalem. But it was not to be. Rabin was assassinated, and the Likud came back to power in 1996 under the leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu, and the Oslo Accord turned out to be a trap for the Palestinians. Netanyahu spent his first term in office in a systematic and largely successful attempt to dismantle the Oslo Accords. He did this by expanding Jewish settlements on the West Bank and increasing the number of Jewish settlers. At the time of Oslo, there were 130,000 Jewish settlers. Today, there are 700,000 Jewish settlers on the West Bank. In 2005, Ariel Sharon carried out the unilateral disengagement from Gaza. This was not a contribution to peace. This was not a prelude to a comprehensive settlement of the conflict with the Palestinians. On the contrary, it was a unilateral move undertaken in what he thought were Israeli national interests. His overall aim was to redraw unilaterally, I stress unilaterally, not by negotiations, the borders of Greater Israel. Step one was disengagement from Gaza, and as a result, he thought he removed 1.4 million Palestinians from the demographic equation. And step two was to build the so-called security barrier on the West Bank. In January 2006, as Dr. Rothschild reminded us, Hamas won a fair and free election and proceeded to form a government. Israel refused to recognize this government, and it took measures to undermine the democratically elected government. And the United States and Europe, in one of the endless examples of Western hypocrisy, sided with Israel in refusing to accept the democratically elected Palestinian government. Netanyahu is no negotiator. Netanyahu is a proponent of permanent conflict. But Netanyahu is not interested in coexistence with the Palestinians, but in Israeli hegemony and increasingly Jewish hegemony or Jewish supremacy. His life mission is to prevent the emergence of a Palestinian state. Netanyahu believed that he found a solution to the problem, which was not to solve the conflict with the Palestinians, but to manage it. And the way he managed it was by weakening the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, humiliating it, treating it as a subcontractor for Israeli policy, gaining a completely free hand to expand settlements, to carry out ethnic cleansing, and to support escalating settler violence with the protection of the IDF, which is escalating all the time as there is a war in Gaza. And as for Gaza, his policy was to allow Hamas to govern the Strip, to allow the government of the Qatari government to fund Hamas and to keep the people of Gaza contained in the prison, the open-air prison of Gaza. On the 7th of October, the Hamas attack took Israel by surprise, inflicted very heavy damage, and it amounted to the collapse of Netanyahu's policy of managing the conflict. He refused to accept any responsibility for the security failure, but the great majority of Israelis blame him for what had happened, and 80% of Israelis would like to see him out of power. So politically speaking, he's probably a dead man walking. As a result of the Hamas attack, the successful attack on Israel, Netanyahu changed his policy towards Hamas. His new war aim is not to allow Hamas to govern, but to eradicate Hamas, to destroy Hamas completely. This aim is clearly unrealistic and unattainable, but Netanyahu needs it for his domestic political reasons, because he faces serious charges of corruption, and he knows that once he stops being prime minister, he would stand trial, and he will most probably end up in jail. So Netanyahu, for his own very selfish reasons, I would say psychopathic reasons, needs a long war in Gaza. The undeclared aim of this war is the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, and there is indeed a leaked government report, government paper, which calls for depopulating the whole of the Gaza Strip. This hasn't happened yet because of Egyptian resistance to this plan to push the Palestinians into northern Sinai, but it may yet happen. It may yet happen, in which case there would be a second Nakba which would overshadow the Nakba of 1948. Another Israeli war aim is to render Gaza uninhabitable, and this aim has been partly, maybe largely, achieved already. By my count, this is the 8th Israeli military offensive in Gaza since Kar Split of December 2008. But it is by far the most violent, the most bloody, the most destructive, the most sadistic, yes, the most sadistic, and it's the first offensive in Gaza which is overtly genocidal. The IDF has murdered over 33,000 people, about 14,000 of them children. Many more thousands are buried in the rubble. The IDF has injured over 70,000 Gazans. It has displaced 1.9 million, 85% of the population of Gaza. And remember, the forcible displacement of civilians is a war crime. So Israel is committing war crimes daily. And Israel has destroyed 65% of homes and of civilian infrastructure. So the main features of this Israeli military offensive is domicide, the destruction of homes, educide, the destruction of the educational system, as we said before, scholasticide, which is the destruction of higher education, cultural genocide, and the ultimate crime, which is genocide. I was going to speak about the American role in all this, but I don't have time, so I'll just say that America isn't simply complicit in Israeli war crimes. America is the enabler of the occupation and the enabler of the genocide. And America vetoed 3 Security Council ceasefire resolutions. So there could have been a ceasefire a long time ago, and even the last one, when America abstained, at the very same time, President Biden signed a deal to transfer to Israel a huge amount of weaponry and munitions on top of the $3.8 billion that in military aid that America gives Israel anyway. So Israel's overall aim is to annihilate the Palestinian people, to smash them into the ground, and it is, as Netanyahu's map to the UN showed, to deny any independent political existence to the Palestinians and any rights. The Palestinians now face two challenges. One is politicide, a systematic attempt of Israel to destroy the Palestinian polity, to destroy Palestinian resistance, and to prevent the emergence of a unified Palestinian leadership leading to statehood. And secondly, the Palestinians now face a genocide, a real genocide, a threat to their physical survival. What does this mean for Israel? I believe that it means the beginning of the end of the kind of violent, racist Zionism as practiced by Netanyahu's government. The occupation destroyed Israeli democracy, if there was a democracy. The occupation completely destroyed that. And as Karl Marx pointed long ago, a people that oppresses another cannot itself remain free. I'm rereading Emil Habibi's novel, The Strange Disappearance of Said the Pesoptimist, the Mutasha'il, and I feel the same way as the Pesoptimist. I am pessimistic in the short term, but I am completely optimistic about the long term. And if I may end on a personal note, I am an Arab Jew. I was born in Baghdad and lived in Baghdad for the first 5 years of my life. And for my family and me, Muslim-Jewish coexistence and harmony wasn't a distant dream. It was the everyday reality. And my own experience encouraged me to think that a better future is possible for our region to replace the present vicious genocide, ongoing genocide in Gaza today. Thank you for listening.
That was Avi Shlaim. You've heard Noura Erakat multiple times here on The Dig. Noura, a brilliant scholar of international law and among the Palestinian liberation movement's most eloquent proponents, is professor in the Department of Africana Studies and the program in criminal justice at Rutgers University. She's an editorial committee member of the Journal for Palestine Studies, a co-founding editor of Jadaliyya, and the author of Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine, a book that I discussed with Noura here on The Dig.
It's day 184 of genocide. Officially, 6 months along today, and only yesterday, the BBC assessed whether Israel was any closer to achieving its military goals of retrieving captives and decimating Hamas, reporting that of the over 35,000 killed, Israel says 13,000 are fighters, but has only published the names of 113 names. And of them, only one of them is a significant military leader, Marwan Issa. The BBC goes on to interrogate that of the 253 Israeli captives, 109 have been retrieved by diplomacy, 3 by military operations, 12 have been killed, 3 of them by Israeli fire, and 129 captives remain between the ages of 18 and 85. 34 are presumed dead. And yet, they also highlight that the cost of this war, this genocide, is some 33,000 Palestinians, 70% of whom are women and children, presumed to be not militants because of their status as women and children, although that obscures the number of men who maintained and retained their civilian status. 1.7 million have been displaced, and there is only one standing city. 56% of buildings have been damaged and destroyed. And the BBC concludes, quote, "It is still unclear whether Israel has met its aims in the war," and yet indicating to us that they don't think so, not brave enough to say so yet. The Wall Street Journal is a bit more brave also yesterday when it went farther in its editorial to note that amid the destruction and the blowback, Israel has, quote, "achieved neither of its war goals of returning all the hostages abducted on October 7th and successfully routing Hamas from Gaza," end quote, and concludes that, quote, "despite many tactical wins on the ground in Gaza, a strategic victory for Israel appears far off." The message is that there is less stomach for Israel's ongoing genocide. This shift is undoubtedly catalyzed by the harrowing attack on 7 foreign nationals who work with the World Cafe Kitchen, who were systematically targeted 3 times as they moved from car to car to car, giving their coordinates to the Israeli army and while traveling in a designated safe zone. The outrage to their assassination is fitting and welcome waters for our parched throats that have been screeching, pointing, forensically analyzing, providing in testimony streams and streams and streams of images and cries that Israel is not fighting a legitimate war. This is not a war against Hamas with collateral damage featuring war crimes and crimes against humanity. This is a genocidal campaign aimed at destroying the Palestinian people in Gaza. Israel is not targeting Palestinians for what they did, but for who they are, as they have been targeting them for 76 years. It is not that they tragically destroy lives in the misery of war, whose purpose, the purpose of this war, is the destruction of a people, and it must be ended without condition or equivocation. And yet 35,000 Palestinian lives have not been enough to compel this change. Neither have been the 13,642 children who have been killed, or the remains of 4 premature babies who rotted in the NICU. Neither was the voice of Hind Rajab pleading for someone to save her in a car surrounded by her family who was murdered, or the image of what was left of Sidra Hassuna's body hanging from the beam of what remained of her home, shredded without legs. The horrors from Ashifa were not enough. Not the 300 dead, not the decaying bodies being feasted upon by ravaged dogs and cats, not the corpses whose arms were zip-tied, featuring bullet wounds of execution, not the gutting of the largest hospital in the north. Our lives were not enough. We did not even qualify for a presumption of innocence. So much of this can be explained by racism, and I have so much to say about racism, racial discrimination, about Zionism, about apartheid, about the gaslighting that we can't, call Israel apartheid because that's desecrating a national liberation movement, which is a settler colonial project. But that's not what I want to focus on. I want to focus on a different part that relates, and continues what Nimr and Shahid have shared with us about the law, which is how the steady development, deployment, and refashioning of the laws of war, Israel has shrunk the category of civilian, of the Palestinian and civilian in particular, so that an increasing number of Palestinians could be tolerated as proportionate in Israel's deadly war, so much that 35,000 Palestinians didn't cause the cataclysmic shift that 7 foreign nationals just have. Beginning in 2000, during the Second Intifada, a militarized Palestinian uprising against the Israeli the Second Intifada was a militarized Palestinian uprising against the Israeli occupation. During this time, Israel began to develop the legal technologies that it would allow it to use a greater amount of military force against the population it occupied. Note here, I'm echoing what Nimr said, that Israel could very well just use brute force, and yet does not do so without mobilizing the law in order to make a case not only for itself, but a case in the law in general. The legal advisors to the army innovated a new category of armed conflict that it called armed conflict short of war. It allowed the Israeli army to use military force against a population that could not legally fight back, be they targeting soldiers, military installations, jeeps, army jeeps, weapons depots, or civilians. All of it in this lexicon is considered terroristic and criminal, deliberately evading legal regulations offered by the first and second additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, which recognized guerrilla combat as a legitimate form of combat and elevated the status of the guerrilla to soldier and combatant with the right to kill and to be killed on behalf of a nascent sovereign. But Israel's outstanding refusal to these additional protocols and to become party to these treaties has stood in as a proposition for now a new form of war. Israeli legal advisors argued that the conditions of resistance that they faced were sui generis, meaning unlike any other in law without analogy or precedent, giving them the latitude to create new law where they insisted no law existed. The novel framework permitted Israel to use preventative force, preventative as opposed to preemptive when something is going to be done with certainty or upon attack, which is recognized as a legitimate use of self-defense, armed force in response to an armed attack, and use this preventative force to extrajudicially execute suspected or would-be assailants in what would later be widely known as the neutered concept of targeted killings in national security circles. A cornerstone of this legal technology is what I call the shrinking civilian, the steady and shrinking scope of Palestinians recognized as civilians, entitled to immunity from attack, entitled to the presumption of innocence, which they have. The shrinking civilian framework has enabled the Israeli law enforcement officers to use excessive and disproportionate force against Palestinians as a matter of law and policy. Two significant architects of the shrinking civilian are Asa Kasher, professor of ethics at Tel Aviv University, and Amos Yadlin, major general of the Israeli army and head of military intelligence. Now, this is significant, especially for us as scholars against genocide, because in so much of the discussion around academic boycott and academic freedom, we tend to think that the Israeli universities are separate from the institution of destruction and harm, and yet they are central to them. And here is a paradigmatic example. In 2003, these scholars and army officers began to reformulate, quote, how to fight terror, where the laws and ethics of conventional war did not apply. This is in the crucible of the Second Intifada and before unilateral withdrawal from Gaza in 2005. Again, they argued that there was no applicable law, as I was saying above, despite the plentitude of law to regulate such combat. Instead, they write, quote, the other side is fighting outside the rules. Israel has to create new ethical rules for international law of armed conflict in keeping with the traditional IDF concept of purity on arms. And so they continued that this meant that Gaza had to be considered a sui generis upon unilateral disengagement 2 years later, when it was neither considered independent now with the ability to control its borders and have a standing army and defend itself, nor was it going to be considered occupied as it is under effective control, but instead it would be called a hostile entity, also subject to armed conflict short of war. In this framework, Kasher and Yadlin now proposed amendments to the laws of war and to combat. One of them, I'm going to tell you about two of them at least. Depending on time, I can tell you more. One of them is the concept of force protection. Force protection is the idea that in assessing proportionality or the military advantage, how much force a belligerent can use, which measures the military advantage to be achieved by an operation and the harm caused to civilians and civilian infrastructure and protected units. So here, the military advantage versus the harm, military advantage includes how many soldiers as part of the belligerent state are spared from harm. So the more soldiers you lose in combat, the less your military advantage is diminishing. So here the idea and the traditional approach is that your soldiers' lives are worth less than the lives of your civilians. So Israel has no problem with this. Its Israeli soldiers' lives are worth less than Israeli civilians. Typically, the lives of the enemy civilians are also worth more than the lives of the belligerent state. But what Kasher and Yadlin propose is that enemy civilians, Palestinians here, their lives are worth less than the soldiers, and then the enemy militants are worth even less than them. This is a radical proposition. This is a radical, dehumanizing, dangerous proposition, because it says that protecting the lives of your soldiers is now worth more than protecting the lives of the civilians who are not trained in war, who cannot pick up arms to defend themselves, who do not have the right to kill and be killed, but should be given immunity in all of these operations. And yet Kasher and Yadlin argued that the lives of prioritizing Palestinian civilians was, quote, immoral, and that an Israeli combatant is a civilian in uniform whose blood is worth just as precious as the blood of all Israeli civilians. Now note that this also is going to the heart of how Israel creates and stands its army, which is a force of conscription, a forced conscription. And so for them, they are not only militarizing and securitizing Palestinians, but they're also turning their soldiers into civilians and even infantilizing them in need of protection. And so hence, we get a liberal killing policy that includes declaring large areas as kill zones to kill anything that moves. According to a soldier following the 2014 offensive, the longest offensive before this one, 51 days. So this is with significant precedent. The soldier in 2014 says, quote, the working assumption states, and I want to stress this as a quote of sorts, that anyone located in an IDF area and areas that the IDF took over is not considered a civilian. There is no status assessment here, that the declaration of an area becomes the declaration of a kill zone. Somehow the revelation of this right now in 2023 seems as shocking to people who are reading it, but they have been telling us this for some time, almost 2 decades now. This is how 3 Israeli hostages were shot dead as they were holding up their white flags and speaking in Hebrew. This is why we witnessed 4 unarmed Palestinian men walking on a road in Khan Yunis to their homes to check on their status, were shot down as if we were watching a video game 4 times. The first strike killed 2 of them immediately. The second strike killed the second one who was stumbling. The third strike didn't kill the third Palestinian man, but he had to be struck twice in order to kill him. They were in a kill zone and thus presumed to not be civilians. And other technology of the shrinking civilian is the concept of direct participation in hostilities. So this is part of the additional protocols regulating guerrilla combat. Under Article 51, subsection 3 of the first additional protocols, civilians forfeit their immunity, quote, for such time as they take up arms. And here the idea is that because there is not necessarily a formal standing army, that civilians will take up arms to participate in combat. And during that time, they forfeit their civilian immunity and can be killed. When they put those arms down, they are no longer legitimate targets. But Kasher and Yadlin proposed that this be amended so that anyone who took up arms be considered a direct participant in hostilities, not merely for the times that they bore arms, but for up to half a year after they've laid down their arms. So someone who participated in a firefight, say for 1 day, put it down, can now be considered for up to 6 months a legitimate target anywhere that they are, regardless of what they're doing, regardless of the threat that they're posing to anyone. In 2006, the Israeli High Court, their Supreme Court, which the Israeli society was up in arms about because now there was going to be a right-wing fascist takeover. But of course it never, and again, Nimit has shown us this, they never were not fascist towards Palestinians. They adjudicated this question in the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel versus the government of Israel. And the High Court concluded, quote, a civilian who has joined a terrorist organization, which has become a home, and in the framework of his roles in that organization, he commits a chain of hostilities with short rest periods between them, loses his immunity from attack for such time as he is committing the chain of acts. Indeed, regarding such a civilian, the rest between hostilities is nothing other than the preparation for the next hostility. And so here we have the High Court endorsing this idea that Palestinian civilians who directly participate, are not merely targets for the time that they pick up arms, but maintain that as a status. They are transformed into combatants. Add to this the fact that there is no distinction between Hamas's military and its civilian arms. It is a government that was elected into office in 2006 with the duty and the mandate to provide healthcare, to provide basic services, to provide a number of services that are delivered through public institutions, including law and order. And yet, because of this lack of distinction between civilian and military function of Hamas, Israel justified the targeting in 2008 and 2009 of a graduation ceremony of police cadets in Gaza. 200 police cadets who were just graduating were targeted in a strike at their graduation alongside their families. And according to Israel's logic, they were preventing them from then being subsumed into Hamas's military arm later. Consider that this is also why Israel targets the hospitals, municipal buildings, roadways. They target everything that they say is associated with Hamas. They also target now systematically low-level officers in their homes, low-level officers who may have picked up arms once, who are in their homes, which has recently been revealed by Yuval Abraham. As now, it's been happening, by the way, this is not new, the targeting of low-level officers and the targeting them in their homes alongside their families in the middle of the night, knowing full well they are surrounded by civilians in residential buildings. But what's been revealed in this genocide is that in 2023, Israel has taken this to a new level, using artificial intelligence technology described as lavender, as well as where's daddy, so cynical, as well as the gospel, which is, targeting the buildings, but also targeting Palestinians on a mass scale that humans cannot compete with zero oversight. The only level of oversight is to confirm that the target is a man, that the algorithm got us a target as a man because the man is presumed as a combatant. So this is, again, there's no presumption of innocence. And then thirdly, the where's daddy technology refers to specifically, because Israel is not targeting militants in the course of combat, but is targeting those who are associated with Hamas or anyone who picked up arms only when they know where they are. And because they're not targeting them in the field, contrary to what they're telling us, that they're targeting them as they're shielding themselves behind hospitals or homes, they're actually targeting them in their homes, because that's the location that they actually know is secure. And this is what they describe as where's daddy. All of this, DPH, force protection, there's new things in 2023 that Israel has offered, including why it believes that it could prevent the access to humanitarian aid if there's any risk of it being diverted to an enemy force. They are also offering in 2023 that military advantage in an operation shouldn't be assessed by the military operation in that moment, but instead by the entire military operation. And according to Israel, that would be decimating Hamas, which is they're not even close. Right? That's how they're adjudicating proportionality. This level of destruction is not new. Following the 2009 operation, when 1,400 Palestinians were killed, including 300 children, while 9 Israelis were killed, including 3 civilians. And I want to do this again, 1,400 Palestinians versus 9 Israelis. 6 of those 9 were Israeli soldiers. In the aftermath of that, this is obviously disproportionate on the face of it. Kasher and Yadlin noted, quote, the concept of proportionality has changed. There is no logic in comparing the number of civilians and armed fighters on the Palestinian side or comparing the number of Israelis killed by Qassam rockets to the number of Palestinians killed in Gaza. So according to them, this is proportionate. So the rest of my comments here is to demonstrate how, although this has been these laws of war, right, or this shrinking civilian has mostly been changed in the course of armed hostilities, or what we would call, combat. Israel also since 2015 has been using this framework in its law enforcement proceedings, so that what police do and what the military do are increasingly blurred. Obviously, a lot of people understand this in the United States, but in Palestine, It's accelerated to a degree where it's institutionalized, so that in 2015, during the height of sporadic attacks by Palestinians, mostly youth, using knives and other makeshift weapons, the Israeli government amended its rules of engagement, regulating the use of police force, blurring the line between armed conflict and law enforcement. The former, where you can use lethal force as a measure of first resort, the latter, where it's used as a last resort. And here you have a blurring on purpose. The amendment permitted officers to use lethal force as a measure of first resort of Palestinians for, quote, the sake of preventing endangerment. As a preventative measure, Palestinians who is about to throw a firebomb, about to shoot fireworks, or about to throw a stone using a slingshot is a legitimate target. In 2016, we saw that Israel, and responding to this loosening of the rules of engagement, Israel lethally shot 97 Palestinians, including 36 children. And although Israel labeled the incidents as alleged stabbings, the Palestinian Center for Human Rights found that 95 out of the 97 documented killings, there was no evidence that the victims had any means to carry out means of attack. The UN Committee Against Torture condemned this in May 2016. In 2017, the Human Rights Council confirmed that Israel uses lethal force against Palestinians, quote, on mere suspicion or as a precautionary measure. And so here we see how Israel has used the law in combat, as well as in police and law enforcement, to shrink who counts as a civilian, using this legal technology and terminology to use preventative force, expanding Israel's right to use force. I won't continue here, but the last thing that I'll say about it is that in 2018, when Palestinians marched en masse, 30 to 40,000 Palestinians weekly marched on a militarized perimeter that has been holding Palestinians, 2.3 million Palestinians hostage for 20 years now, holding them captive, marched en masse in what should have been celebrated. They were shot down like birds. And when Israeli human rights organization challenged the military for sniping them down from a 300-meter distance, the Israeli High Court in 2018 said that their marches were, quote, a new tactic in the struggle against Israel used by Hamas, and further shrunk the category of civilians so that the civilian now in the Gaza Strip exists, but only as a matter of exception rather than the other way around. And so today, it is why we have these outrageous outcomes, not merely because of brute force, not merely because of colonial hubris, not merely because of politics that are blocking the imposition and what international law is supposed to do. Not really. The UN Security Council passed a resolution for at least a 2-week ceasefire that we didn't see any punishment for its failure to adhere to it, right? But precisely because there is a contestation and a battleground in the law to make this not only possible in this moment, not only defensible, not only as an exception, but as a rule moving forward. Thank you.
That was Noura Erakat. Next up is historian Ussama Makdisi. A few months ago, I did a 2-part dig interview with Ussama on Arab-Muslim, Arab-Jewish, and Arab-Christian coexistence in the Mashriq, and how colonialism, imperialism, and Zionism brutally undermined that coexistence and generated violent sectarianism in its place. Here, in these remarks, Ussama probes a profoundly disturbing question that's been on many of our minds for a while now. What explains a Western ruling class commitment to Zionism that's so fanatical and powerful that it leads to the surreal, monstrous, and absurd denial of a genocide that's as brutal and sadistic as it is plainly obvious? How is it, Ussama asks, that Palestinians are resolutely and perversely excluded from an American liberal moral imaginary that has in recent years been committed to memorializing and righting past wrongs like slavery and segregation? Ussama's answer is brilliant and disturbing. Vehement support for Israel, he argues, helped the West make sense of the Holocaust of Europe's Jews without implicating capitalist colonialist modernity in that ghastly crime. And I would add to Ussama's analysis that In fact, the exception made for Palestine in liberal memorialization of past racist crimes is not so much an exception, but rather a point of contradiction that illustrates something important about the quality, substance, and function of racial liberalism's purported commitment to memorialization and reparation. In other words, what the current moment around Palestine reveals is that a lot of this, in this house, we believe racial liberalism was never about the sort of transformative politics that justice would require. On the other hand, American liberals are diverging on Palestine, with the vast majority of Democratic voters now disapproving of Israel's actions. And so, to be fair, maybe some of the In This House We Believe racial liberalism was about transformation, or at least it holds out the possibility of becoming about it. Lastly, Makdisi's remarks echo those made by Frédéric Lordon in a stellar, recently published essay in New Left Review's Sidecar blog, in which Lordon argues that for the Western bourgeoisie, quote, the fascination is with the image of Israel as a figure of domination in innocence. To dominate without bearing the stain of evil. This is perhaps the ultimate fantasy of the dominant. Here's Ussama Makdisi.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Ferguson, Sue. And thank you, of course, to Abid, and Chandni and Erica and everyone at UH and Rice and Houston and abroad who have made this World Academic Forum for Palestine and the Scholars Against War in Palestine event possible. And of course, thank you to each and every one of the previous speakers for their insights, for their testimonies, for the context that they have provided us, for their humanity, their passion, their humility, their resilience, their voices in the face of what all of us either have seen or witness or feel deep in our bones as an unmitigated evil occurring in our time. And especially thank you to all those in Palestine, and thank you to all those, most of all, in Gaza, in Gaza, who have endured what they have endured. As Sue mentioned, I'm a professor here at UC Berkeley, which, as some of you know, is currently under investigation. Not for the fact that it has been silent on the question of the genocide in Palestine and Gaza, but because students and faculty and others have been vocal in support of Palestinian freedom and liberation. So we're being investigated. I'm a professor of history here at UC Berkeley, and like all of you, I feel that we have a right to be angry, we have a right to cry, we have a right to be outraged based on what we have listened to, and what we've been witnessing. We have a right to be upset about the injustice and the genocide, by the double standard, by the silence, the complicity. But we also have a right to be inspired by everything we've heard before, by the people who've spoken before me, by the fact that Palestinians on the ground still persist in living and resisting, despite all the horrors that we've heard about today. What I want to make sense of today, most of all in the few minutes available to me, is the extraordinary situation that all of us, each and every one of us here today finds ourselves in, which is to say, we are living in the face of an intolerable contradiction. On the one hand, there is a genocide that's being live streamed before our eyes that some of the previous panelists have actually been involved in, have seen, have witnessed firsthand, but all of us have seen and followed for the past 6 months. On the other hand, we are living around us. There are people who are in active denial about this genocide. It's the most Orwellian, the most obscene, the most absurd thing that I have ever experienced in my life. This double reality. On the one hand, a genocide that the entire world can see. And this is the first genocide that I'm aware of in history that's been live streamed in this manner, that's been documented in this manner. On the other hand, there are people all around us who are participating in the genocide, who are covering up for the genocide, and these are people we interact with professionally, personally. The society around us participates in the genocide, and our government, above all, is actively enabling and funding and equipping and continuing this genocide. And so, it's this extraordinary situation of, on the one hand, an obvious reality, on the other hand, an obvious denial of this reality. So how is it possible that in the midst of this extraordinary live stream genocide, my university, and virtually, as Abed mentioned at the beginning, every university in this country that I'm aware of, has not taken a single public, decent position on this genocide, condemning this genocide, yet virtually every university, including my own, have publicly come out several times identifying with Israel and condemning Palestinian violence. My association, to which I belong, the American Historical Association, was immediate in its condemnation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and yet here we are 6 months into the most extraordinary genocide of our time, and not a word, not a peep has come out of the American Historical Association. So on the one hand, we know that Western governments are hypocritical and engage in a double standard, and there's racism, and that's the nature of geopolitics. On the other hand, we belong to Western academe, where which doesn't, of course, challenge this order of things. It just polishes its most aggressive edges. And so on the one hand, we have an extraordinary, in the last 20 years in this country, and in the West in general, an extraordinary culture of memorialization of past crimes, slavery, segregation, especially for universities like Rice and University of Houston and others in the South, where there has been an attempt to allegedly come to terms with the past forms of racism and slavery. And yet, when it comes to contemporary current genocide in Palestine, there's not only silence, there's complicity in this. So there's an active denial going on. On the one hand, there's no toleration whatsoever in American academia for anyone today who actively supports Jim Crow segregation or South African apartheid openly, and yet we have amidst us and around us in every university that I'm aware of, people who actively support and apologize for colonial Zionism and for the Israeli genocide against the Palestinians. My own chancellor in this university publicly said that the Palestinian story is wrong. These are the words she used. She said people may believe in it, Palestinians may believe in it, but their story of their politics and their history is wrong, whatever. And so the question for me then is to make sense of what does it mean to say that the Palestinian story is wrong in this moment? What does it mean that so many people who actively condemn slavery and racism of the past today are so utterly invested in either supporting colonial Zionism that is wreaking such havoc in Palestine today, or are silent and intimidated in the face of what is an obvious injustice and depravity? So there's several reasons I want to give in the few minutes left to me. The first reason, the most obvious reason, perhaps, is the material reason. In other words, there have been decades and decades of investment in the story of Israel, in pro-Israel lobbying, in donors, in people who identify with Israel. And they, of course, today put huge amounts of pressure on universities across this country and across the West, for that matter. And so there are material costs, of course, for taking an ethical position. But beyond the material costs, there's something fundamentally much deeper going on here, which is to say there's a history, a much older history of Western Orientalism, of Western racism, of Western demonization and ignorance of the Arab and Islamic worlds that is fundamentally much older. So it's not just a material question, it's also a question of culture. Culture, in other words, Orientalism, demonization, dehistoricization of peoples in the Middle East, and especially the Palestinians, because of what they represent in terms of an ongoing colonialism, and the victims of colonialism. A third part of the reason is a third, so one is material, two is a deep sense of Orientalism. A third is more complicated, and this is probably what explains to me the extraordinary tenor of denialism all around us that makes no sense otherwise, which is to say that after World War II, and this is the history part since I'm a historian, after World War II in the West and after the horrors of World War II, there was a philo-Semitic, and this is our colleague Daniel Cohen at Rice who talks about this, there was a philo-Semitic turn in the West. In other words, Western powers, Western countries, Western philosophers, Western historians, Western theologians, Western scholars, Western leftists, all sort of understood that the World War II and the carnage of World War II and the Holocaust and the obliteration of European Jews in the Holocaust needed some kind of new thinking after World War II. And so they came up with this philo-Semitic humanism, a philo-Zionist humanism that saw in Israel a recompense for the history of anti-Semitism in the West and the history of the horrors, a partial recompense for the history of the horrors of World War II. But this philo-Semitic turn was conditional. In other words, European philosophers, historians, thinkers, writers, leftists, liberals, and others basically claimed to turn a page on Europe's and the West's anti-Semitic past, but at the same time, they generally refused to turn a page on the Western history of colonialism and racism towards the peoples of the non-West. In other words, the continuation of colonialism, the refusal to deal with the history of racism, the history of colonialism, whether it was in America or in Europe, or of course in the colonial world. And so this bifurcation, on the one hand, claiming to be against anti-Semitism, on the other hand, claiming to not really deal with, or actually not dealing at all with the question of colonialism and racism. There was a bifurcation, in other words, in Western humanism, which is why Aimé Césaire, the great sort of poet, and the father, so to speak, of negritude, basically came up, condemned this as a form of pseudo-humanism. In other words, there was a hypocrisy, he said, deep at the heart of Western post-war humanism, which on the one hand claimed to atone for the histories of anti-Semitism, but on the other hand, refused to condemn the histories of colonialism itself. And they separated the fight against anti-Semitism from the fight against racism and colonialism in the non-Western, or against the non-Western peoples. So you add to that the fact that the Palestinians then are expelled from history, as Abid has said, at the same time as Palestine itself is destroyed, and as Palestinians are expelled from their homeland and from their lands in 1948. So Palestinians are decontextualized and dehistoricized. The whole history of Palestine as a place of coexistence, the whole history of the Middle East and the Mashriq as a place of coexistence is erased, is completely denied, and Palestinians are ejected from any sense of having a history of their own. So the only way Palestinians are made to fit into this Western post-war humanism is simply, as Edward Said says in Orientalism, as a negative value. In other words, Palestinians, because they have no history, they're made to have to become a people without history. They're made to be a people without context. They're made to be a people without life, without love, without passion, without history, without meaning, without families, without archives, without anything that's important. They're simply cast either as nameless, faceless refugees who have to be clothed and treated as patients, but not as people. And on the other hand, if they resist this reality, they're turned into demons, and they're turned into a specific form of demons, a Nazi type of demon. And so in the post-war West, you have this sort of triad when it comes to the question of Palestine. You have this extraordinary narrative that gets built up after World War II. The West claims to be a force of good and morality because it fought against the Nazis, on the one hand. On the other hand, it claims to have been the savior of the Jews and the Jewish people who were persecuted, which of course they were persecuted by the Nazis. And third, Israel then becomes the expiation. This is the representation of Israel, and this is of course how Israel represents itself, the expiation of the sin of the Holocaust and the sins of Western anti-Semitism. And in this sort of triad, Western saviors, Nazi evil, and Jewish and the Jewish victims of World War II and the Holocaust, of which Israel then claims to be the representative, the Palestinians have no place. And when they do try to re-enter history, they're always represented as new Nazis because they oppose Israel, and in the West, Israel is seen as the recompense for the Holocaust. So the only way the Palestinians have in this Western narrative is to be, and always to be, represented as new Nazis, which then, of course, brings us to where we are today. After October 7th, what did Joe Biden say? He said that the events of October 7th, of course, he didn't mention history, he didn't mention context, he didn't mention the Nakba, he didn't mention 75 years of history and dispossession and exploitation and colonialism. All Joe Biden said was that the events of October 7th were, quote, as consequential as the Holocaust, which of course is absurd, but on the other hand, is extraordinarily telling because it tells you exactly how Palestinians are framed and fit into a narrative that then allows for their subsequent obliteration. Because the narrative and the racism of that kind of claim obliterates, of course, Palestinian history and justifies the obliteration of Palestinian humanity. It allows for the justification all around us, that all of us, each of us sees in our own professional lives, of people who think that what Israel did after October 7th was correct, was righteous, and that the Palestinians were evil, and Hamas in particular becomes like the new Nazis. It then explains also the deluge, the open deluge of hatred and the obscene US and Israeli statements against Palestinians about erasing Gaza, about obliterating Gaza, about destroying Palestinians, about denying Palestinian civilians. And then finally, it allows for the reality that the doctors before and the panel before me, us, were talking about, this horrific reality that the whole world can see. It allows people to see that or not see that. But even if they do see these images coming out of Gaza, in their minds, they put it in a context of saying, well, it's terrible, but this is what happens because of the fact that Hamas attacked Israel. And you start the story with the Israel being victims. It allows people who support colonial Zionism to not confront their own anti-Palestinian racism. And in fact, it allows them to not confront their own illiberalism and the racism of colonial Zionism. And it allows them finally to not see the perverse irony of where we are today, which is that Israel and the Zionists who support Israel have inflicted on the Palestinians everything that they genuinely, I think, believe was part of their own unique sense of victimhood, which is to say, the dispersion of the Palestinians, the diaspora of the Palestinians being made second-class citizens, Palestinians being subjected to pogroms, Palestinians being herded into ghettos, and of course the Palestinians today being subjected to genocide. And the irony of where we are is that all this is happening at a time when the reality is so obvious. But unless we change the narrative framework, there's no way to actually have any of the testimony that we're giving actually have an impact on these people. The hope, of course, is not to appeal to these people as such, because I think at some level it's a lost cause. At a much more hopeful level, the appeal should be to the younger generation and to people around the world who do, in fact, see and have not been subjected to this narrative quite in the same way, which is to say that we see all around us today an extraordinary, momentous, there is a genocide, of course, and the horrors that can't be pretended away and can't be minimized. On the other hand, there is, without any doubt in my mind, a huge generational shift taking place right now, all around the world, but especially here in the West as well, among the youth, that people who are seeing Palestinians for the first time within their own narrative because of social media, because of the testimonies that people here in this room have provided, and the doctors and the journalists and the Palestinians, especially from Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem and inside and outside, are all providing. Each person is making an impact, and there's a cumulative effect that is taking place that is helping to reshape this narrative. So I'd like to end by just making the obvious point that, and to insist on where we're going, we have to keep providing witness. We have to keep providing and being voices in the wilderness. That means, of course, we have to keep arguing for and historicizing and contextualizing and humanizing Palestine and Palestinians, because we're not afraid of the past. We know the history, and especially the historians amongst us know this history inside out. We have to avoid, second, the self-censorship and the intimidation, because ultimately those of us in the West are privileged. In other words, those of us who are providing witness are in fact privileged people compared to the Palestinians inside. Third, there is, as I said, a generation change taking place. They are the future. And in a sense, all those who are advocating for Palestinian humanity are advocating for a future. Because what's happening now is a complete realignment taking place. The Palestinian narrative, despite the genocide, is going to become inevitably part and parcel of what people and how people think about justice, morality, equality, freedom in the future. And so I'd like to end on that note and thank everyone, each and every one of you, especially my dear colleague, Professor Abdel Takriti, for all the work that he's done in sort of advocating and organizing this conference. Thank you.
That was Ussama Makdisi.
I'm Naomi Klein, and you're listening to The Dig, my go-to podcast for the most thoughtful, in-depth conversation on the left. It's an incredible place to be exposed to new ideas and new writing, and if you can, please become a sustaining supporter at Patreon.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is An Enemy Such as This, Larry Casus and the Fight for Native Liberation in One Family on Two Continents Over 3 Generations by David Correa, now available in paperback. This is the remarkable true story of an indigenous family who fought back over multiple generations against the crushing power of settler colonial violence. From the genocidal Mexican War against the Apaches in the 19th century, through the collapse of European empires in the early 20th century, and culminating in the late 20th century efforts of young Navajo organizers to confront settler colonialism in New Mexico, An Enemy Such as This offers a resolutely native-focused history of colonialism. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz describes the book as a breathtaking and original historical narrative that is also a page-turner. Find An Enemy Such as This at haymarketbooks.org, where readers in the US and UK receive free shipping on orders over $25 and £20, respectively. Next up is the second legendary anti-Zionist Israeli historian that we're featuring today, Ilan Pappé. Pappé will discuss in some depth Zionism's long-term commitment to preempting and destroying Palestinian academic, intellectual, and cultural life. A process that has, over the past half year, reached a grotesque climax as Israel entirely wipes out higher education in Gaza. Palestinians are a famously, extraordinarily well-educated people. Dispossessed of their land, Palestinians have picked up education as a weapon in their struggle, cohering their national identity against attempts at its eradication and bringing anti-colonial wisdom to academia everywhere. Okay. Here's Ilan Pappé, a professor of history at the College of Social Sciences and International Studies and director of the European Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter. Among his many books is The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine.
Hello, I wish I could be with you, and thank you for adding me in the last moment because of technical problems. I hope I'm there. I can see myself in a very weird image on my screen. I hope I look a bit more reasonable on your screen. I would like to remind ourselves that the attempt to use scholarcide and assault on education, whether it is elementary education or higher education, was always part of the Zionist project since its inception in the late 19th century. It was not an immediate concern of the Zionist project when it just started in Palestine, but it was a few decades after the foothold was built, became part of the way or part of the methodology of the Zionist movement, eliminatory policies towards the indigenous people of Palestine. And what is quite incredible that during the British mandate, the British authorities cooperated and collaborated with the Zionist movement in an attempt to undermine educational and particularly academic foundation for the Palestinian national liberation. The impulses of the British colonialist empire were different from those of the Zionist one, and in many ways were more important until the end of the mandate because the Zionist movement was not powerful enough to affect the educational development, especially higher educational development of the Palestinian society during the mandatory period. The British, and this was common to their actions in places such as India and Egypt, believed that if colonized people develop academic institutions, that would lead to political awareness or politicization of the society, which would make it more difficult for the empire to control them. And this is why the British mandatory authorities treated very differently the two communities, the community of Jewish settlers and the Palestinian community, when it came to higher education. While Britain allowed and encouraged the settler community to open two universities, the Technion in Haifa and the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, all the Palestinians' attempt to open a university during the mandatory period were totally rejected by the British. And this is, I think, a very important message from the past. And if I have time, I will go from the past until today when it comes to these attacks on the Palestinian academic infrastructure. While being unable to open a university, Palestinian intellectuals, activists found an alternative way of building an academic infrastructure for the Palestinian community in Palestine during the mandatory period. What they did, they used the various seminars or various teaching seminars where teachers were or people were prepared for teaching careers as clandestine academic institution. The most important of them was the Arab College in Jerusalem, where the curriculum was transformed under the eyes of the British, under the noses of the British rather, into being much more than a typical conventional program for preparing teachers for a career in schools. And actually a lot of other subjects were added in order to give a launching pad for those who participated and graduated from the Arab College in Jerusalem, a chance to continue successfully in universities in the region and in the world. And in many ways, this particularly tactic ensured that by the end of the mandate, despite the continued British refusal to allow any proper higher education system on the Palestinian side to develop, there was already a human capital of academics who started their academic career within these colleges like the Arab College in Jerusalem and continued them in universities in the Arab world and in outside the Middle East. Unfortunately, of course, many of them, they chose to continue with academic career, could not do it in Palestine itself, and contributed significantly and profoundly to the development of academic institutions in the Arab world and beyond. After Israel was established, the Israelis, if you want, took over this idea that an academic infrastructure or an intellectual or university component in the Palestinian society constitutes a target or a danger or an ammunition of the other side that has to be dealt with, took this kind of mission over from the British. And of course, the impulse here was different, was not to prevent politicization, although this was part of what was behind it, but more to contribute to the elimination of the Palestinians as a national movement or a political force to reckon with that could endanger the objectives and vision of the Zionist project or the State of Israel. So one thing we noticed until 1967 inside Israel is how few Palestinian citizens of Israel were encouraged at all to join the Israeli academic system. They were really in very small numbers, and they were directed, as they still do today, directed to certain career patterns in the academia that were meant to distance them from any enrichment of knowledge, both as students of knowledge and then as producers of knowledge, that could augment the Palestinian national identity of the Palestinian minority inside Israel. And again, the Palestinian resilience emerged once more, how to deal with that kind of attack. And that was done with the help of the Palestinian Communist Party, that found a way of getting young Palestinians into universities in the Eastern Bloc that enabled the Palestinian minority inside Israel to develop academic capacities in all disciplines, despite the intention of the state itself to keep it very underdeveloped in terms of higher academic education. When we move to the period after 67 in particular, when it's very clear that the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and in particular when it settles in Beirut as a center, it also provides venues and spaces for Palestinian academic work, whether it is the PLO Research Center in Beirut or the various individual Palestinians who begin to produce knowledge, and in the case of Palestine and Israel, we know knowledge that is within the humanities and the social sciences is not just for a response to intellectual curiosity. It is also part of the struggle itself, whether you develop the paradigm of settler colonialism to explain Zionism, whether you are fighting the allegation that the PLO is a terrorist organization, whether you question the Israeli claims for being a force for modernization and progress, and when you want to contextualize the Palestinian struggle in a wider regional and global context. But of course, the most important part, and this is from the very narrow angle or viewpoint of those in Israel who were the main policy makers strategizing against the PLO between 1969, I would say, and until Oslo, until 1993, within these periods when the PLO was still independently guiding the whole Palestinian liberation movement. Those who make the decision, whether they were the heads of the Mossad, the Secret Service, the Israeli academic Orientalists who joined as advisors, were quite aware that one of the images that they want to destroy is the image of the Palestinian member, especially members of the higher echelons of the PLO, as academics, as intellectuals, as cultural people, as poets, as filmmakers, and so on. And this was, that's why they were targeted, and as many of them were assassinated, as part of the attempt to make sure that the image, especially in the global north, would be of a group of terrorists and not a social, national, cultural movement that also has its own intellectual elite. And the same, in many ways, was done in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, where Israel immediately kind of targeted universities as hotbeds, as they would put it, for terrorism and later fanaticism. And here too, despite the campaigns of assassination, and despite of the constant undermining of the work of Palestinian academic institutions in the occupied territories between 1967 until 1993, Palestinian individuals found ways of continuing research on a high level. And where the door was closed, they used the window, so to speak. And this was, I think, the foundation for what today we have, which are pathways of Palestinian studies all over the academic world in the world. And you can see that the current younger generation of Palestinian intellectuals are resting on the shoulders of Palestinian scholars and scholarship that was able to survive despite the scholarcide and the assault on the infrastructure for higher education and academic networks and establishment. Needless to say that after 1993, the same policies continued, although in the occupied territories, the policing inertia, or the inertia of policing the occupied territories or the Palestinian minority inside Israel was such that everyone was targeted, whether they were part of the academia or not, just to make sure that Israel can maintain through this policing its control directly or indirectly of the Palestinians wherever they are. After the 7th of October, I think we are facing again this, on the one hand, a new chapter in the destruction of Palestinian academic life and institution through what Wissam described for us in the Gaza Strip. And by the way, not only in the Gaza Strip, the situation of the universities in the West Bank today is the worst one since 1967. And the situation of the Palestinian academics inside Israel is the worst that it was for years. And you're probably all familiar with the case of Nadira Shalhoub Kovyan, but that's just one example to what happens to Palestinian scholars and students inside Israel. So there is a comprehensive attack on Palestinian academic life, not only on Gaza, but of course the most ruthless and brutal one is part of the genocide and the destruction of the universities. But at the same time, I think what one can call Palestine studies, or Palestinians who are prominent in academic life, whether they work on Palestine or they don't work on Palestine, but still have huge commitment, like Rassan that we heard, Rassan Abu Sitta, who was elected as the new rector of Glasgow University, which is a huge landmark, I think, in this respect. We are facing an input on global academia, both in the global south and in the global north, that allows not only space for expanding the human capital that young Palestinian academics bring with them, but also the input that such academic work has on the discussion of Palestine, the language that is used on Palestine. And let me just finish by saying that this is another way of resilience that we should not forget, with all the horrific evidence that Wissam brought for us. The Palestinian academic potential and human capital still exists, and will be a very important factor in the continuation of the struggle for liberation in the future. Thank you.
That was Ilan Pappé. Last up is Ghada Ageel Hamdan, a professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Alberta, where she teaches classes in political theory, international relations, and human rights. She speaks here about what her family has experienced in Gaza, massacres, destruction, and displacement taking place on an incomprehensible scale. She also speaks about how Palestinians endure and why they continue to struggle for their liberation.
Amidst the genocide unfolding in Gaza, my friend Abir, a professor in English at the University College of Applied Sciences, posted a message on Facebook. Responding to a neighbor's request for painkiller, Abir wrote, "In Gaza, there is no such thing called a painkiller. In Gaza, we only have killers and we only have pain." The pain that Abir describes and the horror that I hear and witness across space and time surpasses my ability or any ability to fathom, let alone describe. I am utterly at loss for where to begin my testimony. So far, I have lost over 280 members of my own extended family. I stopped counting. Just the mere thought of the number makes my heart sink. We Palestinians are not numbers, yet numbers convey the sheer scale of the tragedy. With each loss I experience, I am reminded with my children questions. Mom, who will be left if we could visit Gaza this summer? What will be left? Who will be there? What will be there? Family Testimony from Gaza is the title of this session, and I am given 15 minutes to share my story, so deciding whom to include is a real challenge for me. For me, the entire 2.3 million people who are living in Gaza concentration camp are my family. I found myself in the same position of Shifa hospital doctors during one of the many massacres committed by the Israeli occupation forces during the Second Intifada, which I witnessed forced to prioritize. During that time, I was working as interpreter for the Guardian newspaper when Beit Hanun was attacked and the wounded flooded Shifa hospital. Men, women, and children, overwhelmed with the sheer murder or number needed the operation theater, doctors were forced to prioritize, gesturing with eyes and eyebrows. Senior doctors instructed the juniors who to begin with. The whole scene became incomprehensible. I stopped interpreting. Together with the nurses, I held the hands of those on the ground of the hospital. I recited verses of Quran. In the absence of family members, I closed the eyes of some of the dead. I moved to the next soon to be a number. Some of the younger doctors could not hold back their tears. The experience left a deep scar on my soul. We need another lifetime to tell our story, and we need another lifetime to grieve, and another life to mourn. Given the limited time, I'll confine my testimony or story to just one massacre experienced by my family. However, this fraction of my story serves as an extension of the broader Palestinian narrative, encompassing both past and present instances of ethnic cleansing and genocide. My name is Ghada Ageel. I was born, raised, and lived most of my life in Khan Yunis refugee camp. My family, however, hails down from Beit Daras village that no more exists on the world map. It has been destroyed and depopulated along over 500 villages and towns in the course of 1948 Nakba. My grandparents and parents are older than the State of Israel. They were born in mandatory Palestine, the only colony that has been abandoned and handed to the Zionist settler colonial project. Forced to leave their village Beit Daras with nothing, literally nothing, and banned by Israel to return, my family ended in Khan Yunis camp, initially intended to be a temporary stop until they could return. Over time, this stop evolved into an enduring one. They lived the misery of the camp, witnessed war after war, attack after attack, and died amid the illegal and immoral and illegitimate blockade imposed on Gaza in 2006. Today, 75 years after the Nakba, I, a third-generation Palestinian refugee, share the devastation of my nation through space and time. On October 20th, I received a call informing me that my apartment towers in Zahra town, where I live in the south of Gaza City, were bombed. Unable to comprehend the news, I asked which one. A moment of silence passed. Then they said, all of them. I passed the phone to my son and wept. All I held dear now lies under the rubble. Everything is gone. Like my grandmother, I am left with nothing. All gone, precious photo albums filled with memories of my school days, moments of captured of my children. First steps, early play. In the blink of an eye, my cherished home is no more. Gone to the records of my journey, my extensive library, some hard-earned certificate, my graduation photos. I felt like a bomb was dropped onto the very substance of my memories. The airstrike obliterated 24 residential buildings that night. Each tower comprised 5 floors. Each floor housed 4 apartments. These apartments were home to around 500 families, all ended in the street. They headed further south. Some made it, some have not. In Gaza, we have only pain and we have only killers. In 2016, I wrote in my edited volume, Apartheid in Palestine, about my great-grandfather who refused to visit his village, Beit Daras. My grandmother asked him why he refused the opportunity when the military occupation allowed so. He told her that he would prefer to die rather than to walk on the ruins of his old home. He said, my home is my flesh, my sweat, my blood, and my bone. It's me, the broken human being you see now. How do you expect to walk on your body? My grandfather believed that there is nothing in life harder than walking on the rubble of one's own home. Today, if he was alive, I would tell him that worse than walking on the rubble of one's own home, not being allowed to walk on it. On October 24th, we received terrible news. The house of my husband's sister was shelled, killing over 30 family members, 3 generations, women, children, doctors, students. We were devastated. My children were weeping, unable to comprehend that they won't be able to see their cousins and aunts again. 2 days later, while we're still mourning, and on October 26, an entire residential quarter of my camp Khan Younis was reduced to rubble, ending the life of over 49 people, among them 36 members of my own family. While in their homes in the area that was supposed to be the safe zone in southern Gaza. We lost my great-uncle Naif, 79 years old, a retired UNRWA teacher, and his wife, together with their adult children, 3 daughters, 4 sons, their daughter-in-laws, and their grandchildren, and their guests who sought shelter there. I can't imagine how not to see them again. I have to tell you about my uncle's family. The minute I step in the camp, my uncle Naif and his family are the first to come congratulate my family that I came back safe and bringing sweets and drinks. Then in the next days, while going to the mosque or coming back from the market, he will knock on our door in the camp with his stick, calling me Ghada, dropping either something he got me from the market or something I love, or something they cooked, or just to have a chat. One of his daughters, Aisha, known of being the cutest face in the camp. She was one of those people who radiated happiness. She's gone. Her sister Dawlat had been living in the United Arab Emirates and was on a visit home to see her family when the bombs fell, leaving behind 2 children who did not even get the chance to bid her a final farewell. The youngest of the sister Umayma and her daughter Malak, aged 3, had also fled the bombardment in the north, but the bombs caught them anyway. My cousins Zuhair, Hassan, Muhammad, and Mahmoud, all killed alongside their wives, Fadia, Naama, and Aisha. Hassan's 3 children, Muhammad, Ismail, and Salma. These beautiful souls are not distant strangers, but one I know well. Naif's surviving son, Ibrahim, lost his eldest son, also called Naif, after his grandfather. A night before the homes were struck, Ibrahim's wife wanted to make room to the displaced from the north. So she took her children and returned to their home at the edge of the camp. Naif, aged 15, wanted to return with his family, but his mother advised him to stay to help his grandfather. For 2 months, from October 26 till December 26, the day in which the entire camp was ordered to evacuate and reduce to ruins, each morning, Naif's mom visited the ruins of the home where her son's body remains buried under the rubble and cried. Each morning as I woke up, I gaze at my son Aziz, the same age of Naif, 15, and find myself in tears. Gaza has become the graveyard for mothers, and Gaza has become the graveyard of children. In that same attack, the home of my grand aunt, Saeed, 92, was also bombed. The adjacent 3 home of her 2 sons, Marwan and Asad, and her daughter Mona were also bombed. Mona was the best to make ka'ak, the pastry we do in our holy month of Ramadan, and the best one to play the drum. At every wedding in the camp, Mona would play the drum all the night, filling the camp with happiness and joy, and everyone would say, Sallim ideki ya Mona, Sallim ideki Fadi. May Allah bless your hands. Mona was murdered along with her 2 sons, Amjad and Muhammad. My aunt's daughter-in-law, Suhaila, a teacher, and her 4 children were also killed. So was the wife of Asad Imtiaz, a teacher, and her sons, Hussein and Abdel Rahman, a 4th-year medical student who scored in high school 99.9. And I must tell you about his dad, Asad. Asad, who ran a small shop, was known throughout the camp as a gentle soul who sold goods for little money. He kept a thick ledger of the names of people who owed him payment, but often forget to call in his debts, or simply he wrote them off. When the bomb fell, Asad's shop was packed with many people who came to buy necessities and also to use his solar energy unit, which he had bought to help people charge their phones and batteries for free. After Israel, of course, cut the water, the communication, the fuel, etc. Among the murdered in the shop were Akram, Rimas, Beirut, Imad, Naima, and other whose names I cannot recall. In truth, the list of the killed innocents is so long and so painful, so many people and so many children. Among those children was Julia, my sister's granddaughter, who was just 3 years old. My nephew Amjad and his wife Rawan left their home in Gaza City with my sister Samia and sought shelter in our camp. When the bombardment began, Rawan took Julia into her arms and rushed to the kitchen. Then the second rocket then the third, then the fourth. The sheer size of the bombs shattered the windows of my family home. Several pieces of the shrapnel got into the house, killing our Julia in her mother's arms. Today, 5 months after the massacre, Block J of Khan Yunis is no more. Today, not only there is no Julia and no Asad and no Mona and no Abdel Rahman. Today, there are no roads, no homes, no shops, no laughter, only echoes of devastation and the deafening silence of loss. In Gaza, we have only pain and we have only killers. And only in Gaza that people are bombed in their homes, on the streets, while collecting water, while sleeping in their tents, while receiving aid, even while in hospital beds. And only in Gaza, drinking water costs blood, and a loaf of bread is dipped in blood. My cousin Yasser, the eldest son of my uncle Naif, who survived the bombardment of October 26, as he was outside his home, was murdered a few weeks ago by a sniper while going to get a sack of flour to his kids. We need another life to mourn. To conclude, despite the pain I shared, Gaza, young and old, men and women alike, continue to shine with their resilience, with their abilities to respond, to defy both the pain and the killer. Among these resilient individuals is my nephew Hassan, aged 23. Last week, and despite the danger, Hassan walked 3 kilometers to reach the edge of Rafah, to connect to the internet and call me. During the conversation, he shared the latest family news, telling me that they managed to collect and bury Yasser's body, and that he had secured a temporary job as a volunteer with UNRWA to assist in distributing whatever aid reaches Gaza. He told me that they distributed eggs and onions that day of the conversation, with each person receiving half an egg, half an onion. So a family of 10, he said, would receive only 3 eggs and 3 onions for iftar during Ramadan. I couldn't comprehend. Nevertheless, Hassan continued to share his news, recounting a story of a woman who had tripped and accidentally broken one of the eggs, leading her to weep for the loss and the death that he had passed by him many times that morning, but spared him for now. At that point, I felt compelled to interrupt him and advise Hassan, please stay home. He responded, you mean stay in the tent? I said, wherever, but don't endanger your life, because on December 26, all the homes of our families have been bombarded, and they ended in Al-Mawasi, an area that's supposed to be for recreation, but now a site of despair, living in tents with nothing. So he said, you mean in the tent? I said, whatever. And then before he ended the call, he asked me, Auntie Ghada, do you remember the poem, if you say it, you will die. If you don't say it, you will die. Then say it and die. I replied, yes, Hassan, recognizing the lines of Gaza grand poet Mu'in Bseiso, known for defying all kinds of system of oppression. So Hassan added, here is my version of the poem. Call it Hassan's poem. If you stay in your tent, you will die. If you go out to help, you will die. Then go help and die. With a laugh, he bid me a farewell and left. This is the spirit of Gaza, and this is the spirit of its people. This is the place I belong to. It's no wonder that the symbol of Gaza is the phoenix, the bird that rises from its ashes. we teach life world. Thank you.
That was Ghada Ageel Hamdan. And those were selected remarks from the inaugural World Academic Forum for Palestine, held over the first weekend of April in Houston, Texas. Visit Haymarket's YouTube page to watch the rest of this historic conference. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinator is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Theorio Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also now Instagram at The Dig Radio. And please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it's on iTunes or Spotify or wherever, please also rate and review us positively. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. But what really and truly does that is you telling other people to check out The Dig. Tell your friends, tell your family, post it on social media, whatever. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com/thedig and make a monthly or annual contribution to help this operation stay up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.